last questions related to, so moving away a bit from the philosophy of mind, psychology, and science, and moving towards the topic of anarchism, morality, and law. So I was wondering, in your view, what are the most important moral underpinnings of anarchism? And maybe even more broadly, how, if at all, do your political views emerge from kind of moral considerations?
Well, as for the latter, I would say almost completely. I don't know what else they could emerge from. But it seems to me that anarchism has meant a lot of different things to a lot of different people. It's a very broad brush. But if you look at the major themes that seem to run through it with many variations, it seems to be essentially an insistence that we question the legitimacy of any human institution, any interaction among people, whether it's in a family or in international affairs, and ask whether that institution involves structures of authority and domination, somebody giving orders, somebody taking them. If it does, we then ask, is that a legitimate structure of domination? And the burden of proof is on those who say it is. If they can't justify it, it's illegitimate. We should dismantle it. And when you look at the world this way, it's very little that you can justify. So you want to dismantle them and construct institutional structures in which people are not subject to the orders of others. And that's all over the society. Taking a job, for example, is subordinating yourself to an authoritarian, virtually totalitarian structure for most of your waking life. For most of history, from classical Greece and Rome up until the 19th century, that was considered a total abomination. Abraham Lincoln's Republican Party regarded it as the same as slavery. American workers regarded it as a fundamental assault on human dignity. It's taken about a century of indoctrination for people to internalize the idea that your goal in life is to get a job and to be dependent on somebody else, to be their slave for most of your life. So, and one of the simple principles of anarchism would say, question that. Ask whether that's right. Should you be subordinated? Should any person be subordinated in that fashion? And that applies everywhere, wherever you look. So I think that's the moral foundation. Then come the question of working it all out.
That makes sense. And just one follow-up question, specifically on like this question indeed of justifying authority, and I would like to bring in Kant one more time, and then I will stop. But when discussing authority, most people talk often indeed about the authority of the state or the authority of the church. But Kant also famously talks about the authority of reason, which is actually self-legislating and self-justifying, and provides a framework of moral constraints. So not necessarily defining this is what you ought to do, this is reasonable. So Kant says, for example, reason is no dictator, but merely in the sense of these are negative constraints that ought to be in place at any moment of time. Do you see kind of those negative constraints? Can those be specified into certain principles? Of course, we have the skeptical principle in the sense of please justify yourself if there's authority, but are there additional specifiable normative constraints that you would say, yes, these are the top three in how I define anarchism that I think are crucially relevant?
I think that's implicit in our discussion of the moral underpinnings of anarchism. When we ask, is the structure, if we identify something as a structure of authority, we're using the principle of reason. If we argue that it is, if we ask for a justification of its legitimacy, we mean a rational justification. So if the boss says, I justify it because I like it, that's not enough. There's one of the leading economists, economic gurus of what's called libertarianism in England and the United States, very different from traditional libertarianism, but the kind of capitalist, anarcho-capitalist libertarianism. James Buchanan, he's one of the founders of public choice theory, Nobel laureate, one of the gurus of the movement. He argued famously that society should be based on human nature. And then he says, what's human nature? Of course, he says, well, human nature is he says, for each person, his ideal situation, his nature dictates that his ideal situation is to rule over a world of slaves. That's everybody's nature. In case you hadn't noticed it, that's your highest ideal, to rule over a world of slaves. Well, if that's the justification for authority, I don't think that satisfies the condition of reason. Mm-hmm. Yes, we're appealing to assumptions about reason. Mm-hmm. So, for example, if James Buchanan says that's human nature, fine, let's have a discussion of theory of human nature and investigate it. Mm-hmm. I think we're going to find that it's pathological.
Yeah, definitely.
But that's the inquiry. It's an inquiry which will be carried out in accord with the principles of reason. If mm-hmm. part of the argument is a P and not P, we discard the argument.
Mm-hmm. I see. Yeah.